Aristotle was a keen observer of the natural world. He saw that organisms tended to develop over time and seemed to have a natural aim or purpose. Following in the tradition of Greek philosophy, he thought that the purpose of human beings was to achieve happiness by living virtuously. Politics was essential to Aristotle because it was in our nature to live together in political communities. He conceived of politics through metaphors taken from the natural world. A polis or city-state was like an organism which required all of its parts to work alongside each other as part of the whole. The city was not just an abstract set of laws, but a partnership between people and a community where together they could seek the good life. The question of politics was therefore which type of regime would best allow us to live according to our nature and achieve happiness. For Aristotle, this would be a mixed regime in which the interests of different classes were balanced and the city was governed according to the rule of law. Aristotle offered a comprehensive philosophical system that covered nearly every branch of Western philosophy. To Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle was simply the philosopher, and his status was unparalleled right up to the 19th century. I'm James Muldoon, I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter, and this video will examine Aristotle's political thought as set out in his book Politics. Aristotle's life. Aristotle was born in 384 BC in northeastern Greece in the city of Stagira in Macedonia. His father was a doctor, and Aristotle was introduced to Greek medicine and biology at an early age. His parents died when he was a child, and Aristotle was sent to Athens at the age of 17 to study in Plato's academy. He was a foreigner to Athens and was not entitled to citizenship or the right to take part in the democratic assembly. This is remarkable because of his claim that to live a full and rich human life, one must be able to participate in politics. In 343 BC, King Philip of Macedon requested that Aristotle tutor the king's son, a 13-year-old who would become Alexander the Great. But there's little evidence that Alexander was significantly influenced by Aristotle's teachings. Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BC and set up his own school called the Lyceum. Around the time he left Athens, Aristotle had become increasingly critical of Plato's central doctrines, and he developed his own, more empirically minded philosophical system. He taught at the school, and many of his philosophical writings that survive today are thought to have been lecture notes for use by his students. After 13 years in Athens, Aristotle fled in 323 BC due to rising resentment against Macedonians. Referring to the trial and death of Socrates, he remarked that he saw no reason to permit Athens to sin twice against philosophy. He died shortly after leaving, and there are 31 surviving treatises of his work. Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle considered knowledge about politics to be a practical knowledge, something that would help you live better in the world. He worked out a systematic philosophy in which knowledge of the world was divided into three main branches of inquiry. For Aristotle, all knowledge could be considered theoretical, practical, or productive. The first branch at the bottom of the diagram is the theoretical sciences. Theoretical science seeks knowledge for its own sake and includes metaphysics or a theory of being, mathematics, and natural philosophy or physics. The second branch of knowledge is the practical sciences that are concerned with how to act in the world. These involve questions of the individual and society, which meant it included ethics and politics. The close proximity of ethics and politics was because Aristotle thought that a well-organized political community was essential for individuals living a virtuous and harmonious life. In the third branch, we have the productive sciences, which are concerned with making useful or beautiful objects. This includes arts and crafts, but also other activities such as medicine, agriculture, and shipbuilding. Aristotle classified rhetoric, or the art of persuasion and speech-making, in the productive sciences because it concerned a know-how of creating persuasive speeches. His work Politics, under examination here, concerns the practical knowledge of political science, which studies the tasks of the politician or statesperson and analyzes the appropriate types of constitutions, laws, and education for citizens. His approach to the study of philosophy is very different from Plato. Plato thought that philosophy involved moving beyond the world of our senses, while Aristotle had a much more empirical focus. He thought that we could have a direct access to the real world, and that knowledge could be derived from our senses. He thought it was important to start with how things appeared to us, and also to collect reputable opinions on a topic. To understand something, you should start by doing a kind of literature review of what people currently know before you start to systematize these opinions and make your own judgment. Rather than reject opinion outright, like Plato, Aristotle thought that much could be learned from what was generally accepted on a topic. In the sphere of politics, Aristotle had his students travel throughout Greece to collect information on the regimes of 158 different Greek cities. He used this information of practical examples to support his arguments. Nature and purpose. Aristotle saw in nature a hierarchically organized world in which all living things have a soul and in which everything follows a natural trajectory of motion towards a given purpose or end. Natural things are in a constant state of change and developed according to their inner nature. Just as it's in the nature of an acorn to grow into an oak tree, so too do human beings have a natural development and goal. This development can be deformed and follow bad pathways, but for Aristotle this would be a deviation from what we were supposed to become. As human beings, we have a set of capacities and a potential to be something. Our nature tells us what we could become under ideal conditions. The natural purpose or telos of human beings for Aristotle was to achieve happiness or eudaimonia. This term eudaimonia is sometimes translated as flourishing, to indicate there was not just a transient feeling of joy, but an ongoing condition and habitual practice of living well. A state is an association of similar persons whose aim is the best life possible. What is best is happiness, and to be happy is an active exercise of virtue and a complete enjoyment of it. He thought a virtuous character was within reach of anyone through the correct habituation of virtuous action. If we aren't living a virtuous life, then we can't be fully actualized as human beings for Aristotle. Ethics. Ethics is the study of character so that we can become the kind of people who are disposed to act virtuously in all circumstances. There is an intimate relationship between Aristotle's ethics and politics, because to achieve the highest perfection of human life requires living in a polis or city-state. It's only through political action with others and living a practical as well as a contemplative life that a person can fully actualize themselves. At the end of his book on ethics, Aristotle says that the goal of a political regime is to cultivate the virtuous character of its citizens. This is why the type of state is going to be so important to Aristotle, because it's only in certain types of political association that human beings can realize their political nature. Aristotle's politics. In his book Politics, Aristotle is concerned with how a city-state or polis should be organized to promote the happiness and virtue of its citizens. Human beings can only flourish and actualize their nature within the framework of a well-organized state. He who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must be either a beast or a god. One of the central questions of the book is what type of regime best meets the needs of human flourishing. Who would be in charge? How would it be structured? And how would its citizens be educated? Politics is divided into 8 books that look a lot like lecture notes. There are a couple of chapters that are incomplete, and there's an ongoing debate as to whether they're published in the order he originally intended. The book begins by giving an account of the purpose and origins of the polis. Aristotle defined a polis as a political community who come together to pursue a common good. The highest good of the city is the virtue and happiness of its members. This is really different from most modern definitions of the state, which focus on it guaranteeing security while leaving individuals free to pursue their own private lives. Aristotle saw the state primarily as a partnership, a common venture of free and equal citizens for achieving a shared project. The goal of politics was to create the conditions for citizens to act virtuously and cultivate their character. The state is different from the management of the household. The art of household management is about creating wealth, and the household is made up of hierarchical relationships between master and slave, husband and wife, and parent and child. He thought all of this was exactly as nature intended. His political theory relies on a form of political naturalism, that human beings are naturally disposed to live with each other, and that the city-state is a natural unit of politics. This is where we read Aristotle's famous claim that man is a political animal. What does he mean by this? Human beings live together in groups, but so too do lots of other animals. What makes humans so unique? Many philosophers have asked this question, and for Aristotle it was our logos, which means both reason and speech, that separated us from other animals. Human beings can speak to one another and deliberate over what is useful and harmful, what is just and unjust. Speech allows us to come together and live a superior form of life by acting virtuously and fulfilling our natural purpose as human beings. He also argued that the city-state is not an artificial entity, like most modern theorists would argue. He thought that it arose naturally from smaller, more primitive forms of association. He imagined that at first families would form through the need to procreate, then villages would form from several families, and finally a city-state would form through the combination of several villages. It was only at the level of the city that Aristotle thought you had an association that was big enough to be self-sufficient and to be a properly functioning political community. But not everyone would be an equal member of the city-state. It's well known that only free men who were not slaves or foreigners could be citizens of democratic Athens. Aristotle thought that slavery could be considered legitimate and that man should rule over women because of natural differences between human beings. His arguments in relation to each point are not that convincing and represent the prejudices of his age. He justified these natural hierarchies based on a difference in a capacity for reason. For Aristotle, a slave is completely devoid of reason, and this justified a master making decisions on their behalf. With regards to women, he claimed that while they had reason, in his words, it lacked authority. This could be taken to mean that women's reason was equal to men's, but that they could not command men for whatever reason. Other interpreters have suggested that Aristotle believed a woman's emotions were more influential in determining her behavior than reason, and this is why their reason lacked authority. Whatever interpretation you prefer, Aristotle was convinced that women were inferior to men and should be subjected to their rule. This wasn't the same kind of rule as a king over their subjects or a master over their slaves. It was a partnership which should also be of benefit to the wife, but it wasn't an equal partnership. According to Aristotle, women had their own telos or purpose within the household, although he didn't spend much time fleshing out exactly what this entailed. Citizenship and the state. Aristotle defined a citizen as somebody who had the right to participate in a democratic assembly or judicial office. He thought full citizenship would exclude women, children, slaves, and foreigners. But for those who were citizens, they would have the right to directly participate in deliberating on and making laws, rather than just voting for representatives. Material conditions would influence who could be a citizen, because for Aristotle, citizens must have sufficient free time to engage in politics, be economically independent, and be able to exercise independent judgment without being beholden to another. So only a certain type of person who was the head of a household and had their basic needs taken care for them by others could fulfill the duties of active citizenship. Aristotle didn't think it would be ideal for artisan workers to be included as citizens, because they wouldn't be able to devote enough time to politics. He also thought that geography and demography might influence the franchise. If a population was dispersed across a large area, it might be difficult for all citizens to assemble. If the population was small or the state was under threat, it might be harder to exclude people who would be needed to fight for the state. The particular circumstances of each state would determine the size and makeup of the citizen body. A politician or lawgiver should concern themselves with the politeia, a Greek word from which we get politics, and which could be translated as constitution or regime. What he meant by this term politeia or constitution was a way of organizing the officers of the state and answering such questions as who would rule and what power they would hold. For example, a regime could be organized as a democracy where many would rule, or as an aristocracy where the few wealthy or well-born would rule. For those who would govern, Aristotle thought that politics entailed using their logos or speech and reason to debate politics and therefore fulfill their nature by deciding on how to achieve a virtuous and happy life with other citizens. What it meant to be a good citizen would depend on what type of regime they lived in, because different types of regimes required different kinds of virtue. A typology of regimes. Aristotle used his data gathered from across Greece to create a typology of regimes that was so successful that it was used by theorists for the next 2,000 years. Aristotle used two criteria to establish his typology. First, who was ruling? Was it one person, a few people, or many? Secondly, did these rulers govern in the interests of themselves or in the interests of all citizens? Of the good types of regime, Aristotle thought that you had monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, which was rule in the interests of all citizens by one person, a few people, or the many. In the second row are the deviant forms of government, where the rulers governed in their own interests. This resulted in tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Aristotle goes on to list a number of varieties within each category. For example, he listed 5 different types of monarchy, but the central typology consisted of these 6 main forms. The first noteworthy aspect of the chart was that Aristotle thought democracy was a perverted form of government, where the many, by which he implicitly meant the poor, ruled in a way that attempted to dominate the rich. He followed Plato in seeing democracy as a deviant form of mob rule. Later in the book, Aristotle clarified that his typology did not just refer to how many, but also relied on a distinction based on wealth. The few, he argued, are usually the wealthy, while the poor are many. Hence, oligarchy and democracy are not simply ruled by the few and many, but also tend to mean rule by the wealthy and the poor. He recognized that there would be many competing claims to rule in a polis. The few would argue that they had good birth, wealth, or nobility, and that these should entitle them to rule. But he thought that wealth shouldn't be seen as a valid claim for rule, because the polis existed for the sake of achieving the good life and not just for becoming rich. He also thought that the freedom of the many wasn't the best claim to rule either, because although they might be free, they wouldn't necessarily act in the interests of the common good. He rejected Plato's claim that rule of a monarchy or aristocracy would be the best form of rule. Ideally, the wise and virtuous have the strongest claim to rule, but such perfect rulers are nearly impossible to find, and it would be highly unlikely that one person would be more virtuous than the rest combined. It might be more likely that a small group of the most virtuous citizens could rule over others, but this would unjustly exclude everyone else from developing their capacities. As a practical compromise, Aristotle preferred a form of polity. Polity is a translation of the Greek word politeia, which is somewhat confusingly both the generic word for regime or constitution, but also in different points in the text, Aristotle's term for what he considered the best practical regime. For those of you who've read Plato, polity is also the title of his book on politics, which has been translated as The Republic. The best polities would also be governed through the rule of law. He thought that the law would always reflect the particular biases of the regime, but that it offered a degree of impartiality that was superior to a human judge ruling according to their own desires. For Aristotle, polity was a mixture of oligarchy and democracy. It was a regime in which the many don't attempt to exploit the wealth of the rich through their political power. It combined certain aspects of democracy and oligarchy and didn't let either class dominate. Aristotle was against any single faction with a state gaining control over the instruments of government. He didn't actually give any examples of polities, and it's unclear whether he thought any actual polities have ever existed. For Aristotle, great wealth inequalities were one of the principal threats to politics. He thought that it created pathologies for people to distance themselves from participation in public life, and to see themselves as outside the body politic. For the rich, this was because their wealth led them to hubris and the idea of dominating their fellow citizens. For the poor, they felt excluded from the city and wanted to take revenge on the wealthy. Members of the middle class were more likely to see each other as equals and be willing to be ruled and rule in turn. Aristotle's politics has been so influential because he offered a seemingly comprehensive picture of the value of political life and of the different existing types of political regimes. It appeals to our desires to be able to judge what is the best form of politics, and also to a scientific inquiry of observing different political phenomena. He was considered an authority not only on questions of politics, but on metaphysics, biology, zoology, rhetoric, logic, ethics, history, poetics, and psychology for hundreds of years. He's still considered a touchstone for Republicans who want to understand politics in terms of the pursuit of the common good and active participation in political community. Greek political thinking was radically transformed in the Christian era with the influence of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and it's to their thought that we'll now turn in the next videos.